Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 2 of Series 6. And the question this evening is, what is mind or consciousness and how can it inform a philosophy of life? Reading, for those who want it, from my work, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 6, Section 1. In last week's introduction, I outlined the significance of consciousness and how it has been neglected. I also noted how that neglect leads to a failure of understanding oneself and to a further neglect of value. But I said that a foundation for value can be found in the subjective structures of consciousness, and that consciousness is a gateway into grasping the enigma of human existence. Yet understanding the mind and consciousness has implications for every aspect of philosophy, as well as for questions of life. It has implications for issues like the mind-body identity problem of, is mind a refined aspect of matter or another species of being? Or in the question of personal identity, who am I, or what kind of beings are we? And what are values? Are they mental states or aspects of the world? And what are their origins? So my question this week is about the character of mind or consciousness and its significance. A basic definition is found in the distinction between mind and consciousness, often used interchangeably. Broadly speaking, mind can include every aspect of mental life, like the unconscious and animal minds. And like John Searle, we can provisionally define consciousness as all the mental states that we experience. We can also distinguish between consciousness and typically human reflective or self-consciousness. And of course, in my view, the physical brain can be distinguished from both mind and consciousness. There are also many theories and ways of understanding mind, of which we will outline shortly a few, such as dualism, physicalism, monism, externalism, pluralism, panpsychism and panpsychism, as well as functionalism and behaviorism. I myself hold an interactionist theory of mind and a structural account of consciousness as a process or relation. I will explain and argue for this position or positions later in this workshop. We should further note three different questions that are often conflated and hidden in theories of mind. 1. What is the ontological status of mind as either physical or mental? Asked in analytic philosophy. 2. What are the preconditions of mind? That is, neurological preconditions are often taken as the mind itself. 3. And the question, what is the character of mind? And this is my main objective here. A final caution could be made about the confusion over the character and definition of consciousness. There is so much misunderstanding on this matter that we must never accept any view on authority. More than other aspects of philosophy, we can only accept views that we at least understand for ourselves. And although we had differentiated between mind and consciousness, we sometimes use these interchangeably. This is often due to how they are traditionally used in such as the mind-body identity debate. Dualism is a default view of the distinction between the physical world and mind, often described as spirit or soul. Descartes is the primary advocate of a philosophical version of dualism. He characterized mind by rationality, transparency, indivisibility, and non-extension in space. And he further described mind as a thinking substance. These properties are supposed to define mind as a different kind of existent to the physical world. But both the properties themselves and the Cartesian relation to mind to the world have been widely rejected. This is partly because Descartes took the notions of both rationality and substance from Renaissance science. Transparency is refuted by the presence of the unconscious, and indivisibility by split brain and other discoveries. And in my view, although mind may not be extendable in space, it is subject to graduation. So when reversed as opposites, Descartes' properties begin to provide certain features of mind. But two unacceptable features of a Cartesian conception of mind are: one, a conception of mind as substance or a kind of definitive object. Two, the difficulty of explaining how a Cartesian immaterial mind can act causally on the world. The widespread rejection of Cartesian dualism led to the supposedly more scientific view of physicalism. That is, mind and matter are composed of the same physical stuff, of which mind is an extremely refined kind. Physicalism, materialism, physical monism, and mind-body identity view are of this same view. Although intuitively unattractive, physicalism is dominant in analytic philosophy. Yet there are tacit forms of physicalism, such as describing mind or consciousness as energy. Three main arguments can be cited for physicalism. 1. Despite appearances, dualist perceptions are mistaken and see one thing as two. For example, the morning and the evening star, which might be thought as two different things, but are in fact the same thing. But although some perceptions are mistaken, dualist claims that they aren't mistaken because they are perceiving themselves, which is a different kind of object. 2. The coherence of science requires unity under the same principles without ontological disjunctions. But this might be an illicit ulterior motive, and pluralism, examined shortly, undermines this claim. 3. Science and neurology can provide a detailed explanation of mind as an aspect of the physical world. But this is highly contested as a current ability in science, and is seen rather as a future aspiration. Moreover, against physicalism, anti-physicalist views need not be either Cartesian dualism or dualist. Alternatives include externalism, pluralism, panpsychism, and panpsychism, discussed shortly. And other forms of moderate dualism are available without the unacceptable Cartesian features. Many of the alternatives to physicalism cite properties of consciousness which cannot be attributed to matter. These are properties like intentionality, cognition, sentience, temporality, and personal identity. I myself add structures like graduation, divisibility, insularity, ephemerality, and insubstantiality. The argument is therefore that consciousness cannot be the same kind of thing as matter. In illustration, I can take one structure, ephemerality, from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's The Little Prince. That is, there was a time when I didn't exist, and there will be a time when I no longer exist. But the law of conservation of mass states that matter can change form but not be created or destroyed. So ephemerality is a characteristic of consciousness that argues against a physicalist ontology. We should notice a couple of things in this present discussion. One, it has shifted from discussing mind to consciousness, which is a more distinctive entity. Two, arguments about properties and other arguments have also served to begin to define consciousness. Saul Kripke argues against physicalism by distinguishing personal identity as a property of consciousness. Personal identity isn't attributable to the physical world, and it is discovered by an a priori awareness. Physical identities are discovered contingently in an a posteriori fashion. This distinguishes a unique aspect of consciousness that differentiates it from physicality. But a physicalist claim is that brain scans and fMRI can show a correspondence between neurology and mind. But this might show a correspondence between mind and brain, but doesn't prove mutual identity. Moreover, this correspondence lacks precise detail and again only hoped for by faith in a future scientific advance. Accounts by Libet and Harris are conclusive and overlook causation through holistic complexity, and such failures of correspondence lead Donald Davidson to speak of anomalous monism. The outcome of this short section is that arguments for both dualism and physicalism aren't conclusive, and non-physicalist theories other than dualism are available, which we should now consider. One of them is pluralism, which is the view that there aren't just one or two species of being, as in physicalism or dualism, but many. Karl Popper maintains three species of existence that are matter, mind, and its abstract products. Different versions of this are held by Roger Penrose, Hubert Dreyfus, and Merleau-Ponty. In support of pluralism, we can also refer to the ontological status of mathematics and logic. Mathematical structures are not physical in any way. They are abstract through and through. Mathematical or logical ideas exist independently, like in a book, and are not states of mind. The argument can be posed very simply in the following way. Mathematics exist. 2. It is neither physical or mental. 3. Therefore, it is a third species of existence. Pluralism challenges both the supposed unity of science as well as the categorizations of both dualism and monism. This is because the existence of abstraction raises the question of specific criteria of determination. Abstractions are indisputably non-physical and are subject to a priori and necessary relations. Materiality is indisputably physical and is subject to a posteriori and contingent relations. Therefore, unity of neither method or ontology exist in science, so cannot be validly used as an argument. So we can note several consequences or benefits of pluralism. One, it provides an alternative to or moderates both physicalism and dualism. Two, properties of abstraction argue against both physical monism and a unity of science. Three, abstraction and physicality ontologically flank mind, rendering it more comprehensible. But in themselves, these arguments don't demonstrate the validity of pluralism. Panpsychism, though, goes further than pluralism to claim that consciousness is everywhere and in everything. Panpsychism is favoured by David Chalmers, Colin Blakemore, Galen Strawson, Whitehead and others. John Searle calls some of the outcomes of panpsychism absurd, like Chalmers' belief in conscious thermostats, and I agree that it is seriously flawed. And I regard panpsychism as an indication of the confusion surrounding consciousness. Strawson argues for panpsychism in the following way. 1. Mind exists. Well, most of us can agree with the premise. 2. Mind can't be produced from non-mind. But this is a very contentious view, and there are no good reasons to suppose that mind can't be produced from non-mind. We might also mistakenly reason that biological life can't be produced from inanimate chemicals. 3. But Strawson concludes that, therefore, mind is everywhere. But his second premise above is in doubt, and the plausibility of his conclusion is also challenged. This is because of the stronger counter-argument that consciousness has properties that don't exist in the physical world. Mind or consciousness has properties like intentionality, cognition, sentience, and ephemerality. These properties do not exist in everything and aren't everywhere in the world. Therefore, consciousness, as it must be defined, does not exist everywhere and in everything. Yet there is a stronger form of panpsychism in Hindu and Buddhist thought that consciousness precedes matter. Even Max Planck said that I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. Ian McGilchrist holds that matter is a phase of consciousness. And Donald Hoffman believes that consciousness creates all objects and properties of the physical world. But in addition to earlier problems, these views face further overwhelming problems. These problems are explaining what created consciousness and how consciousness can produce matter. These are seemingly are resolvable only by appealing to a larger problem of a creator God. Pan-protopsychism is an alternative to panpsychism, which retains the idea of natural and universal emergence. On pan-protopsychism, mind isn't everywhere, but there is a ubiquitous property that produces mind. The big question here is, what is this ubiquitous property? I will consider this property as a process of interaction within all matter, and I'll consider this in greater depth next week. Before that, I need to outline externalism, that consciousness is produced by interaction with the external world. And externalism argues that there is an overemphasis of brain neurology in explaining mind. Ted Honderich describes this as the impulse to etherealize or cranialize consciousness. Other externalists have described this tendency in similar terms. Sean Gallagher gives us the notion of neurocentrism. Rom Harry, the idea of neurological fallacy. And Raymond Tallis speaks of neuromania. Externalism regards relations, events and experiences in the world as complex and as necessary as brain events. One argument for this is that brains without worlds can't produce mind, that is, as a brain in a vat. Following this thinking, Alverno holds that we have made a category error in misunderstanding mind. That is, understanding mind in terms of brain is like understanding the monetary value in terms of metallurgy. No presents mind as a relation, process or interaction between a centre and external objects. Numerous thinkers are developing such a relational and process view of consciousness. For example, Riccardo Manzotti sees externalism going beyond the brain as a process relating to the world. Even theologian Don Cupid sees consciousness as relation and as a temporal process. But externalism implies relations and processes that depend on unexplained structures of consciousness. Yet the idea of structure and phenomenology and the relation between them isn't always recognized. But it becomes apparent when pointed out in the work of Husserl, Heidegger and Sartre. The diversity of the external world as one of the preconditions of consciousness is illustrated by Sartre. Sartre does this by making an identification between consciousness, choice and selection. He writes that choice and consciousness are one and the same thing. And he writes, choice isn't just a preference, but a selection traced back to its ontological foundation. But Sartre doesn't actually provide an analysis tracing choice back to its ontological foundation. But we can fill in by saying that contrast is a form of selection essential to cognition and thereby to consciousness. And we can continue to say that choice expressed contrast and selection. For example, when I look left or right, I affirm what is on my right and negate what is on my left. These are the kind of selections that are essential to epistemic contrasts and perceptions. For example, a white spot on a white board can't be seen. It needs a contrast. The contrasts and selections of an external world are thereby essential to consciousness, and that such contrasts and selections constitute the relational aspect of consciousness. So consciousness can be seen as a process in at least two ways. One, as a graduated process of development in species as well as individuals. Two, in Heidegger's view of temporality and time as the horizon of being. Heidegger's Dasein is a being in the world, or essentially in relation to the world, that Husserl called the life world. Yet Heidegger also emphasized that Dasein was in the world of temporality and time. Husserl had similarly previously spoken of the flow of consciousness and a flow of becoming, in which every experience has necessarily been preceded in time by experiences. There is here the notion of time as an essential as an essential feature of consciousness as an ongoing process. We not only find ourselves in a world of time or temporality, but time is a constituent of consciousness. We find ourselves in a world of time as well as diversity, divisibility, selection and choice. Consciousness is moving through time as well as through the diversity in space. And that movement is a developmental process. I initially proposed an interactionist theory of mind and a structural account of consciousness as a process or relation. Yet mind includes pre-conscious states that we haven't yet explained by means of interaction. Conscious interaction with the external world isn't the same kind of interaction that produces mind at its inception. That is, cognitive interaction with the world isn't the same as the physical interaction that produces mind. Yet the principle of interaction is common to both the physically causal interactions and mental interactions. It's in this way that I want to link and explain the relation of mind to the physical. This was described by David Chalmers as the hard problem of consciousness. That is, even after all preconditions have been explained, why should consciousness still emerge? At one level, the problem is impossible to resolve due to Hume's critique of causality as constant conjunctions. Yet we can and will always be able to reduce that gap between explanation and phenomenon. This is the task posed by panpsychism of discovering a ubiquitous property that produces mind. I will discuss panpsychism, as I said, as an explanation of the preconditions of consciousness next week. We earlier noted the structures of graduation, ephemerality and temporality as characterizations of consciousness. And we listed other structures like intentionality, graduation, insularity and insubstantiality. These aren't preconditions of consciousness, but descriptive features or inherent structures. The structural perspective is further evident in Heidegger's concept of Dasein as a being in the world. This view is renowned for its dissolution of Descartes' subject, object and world dichotomy, and the conception of consciousness as relation, process and structure further undermines both of these. That the Cartesian dichotomy and the idea of consciousness itself as another kind of object. Sartre unrestrainedly names a multiplicity of features as structures. These include freedom, choice, presence, facticity, value, possibility, negation and finitude. But I think that these are features or properties rather than structures because they aren't internally inherent or give shape or form to consciousness. There are of course arguments for both for and against structures. The basic argument for structure is as follows. 1. Consciousness exists. 2. Therefore it must have properties. 3. those properties are best described as structures. But postmodernists reject universal structures. They claim that structures cannot underlie the whole of human life, but they are directing their attention to the social and psychological structures as given by such as Marx and Freud. Yet phenomenologists are instead talking about structures of consciousness, not of psychology or society. And postmodernism has physicalist inclinations which rule out consciousness and thereby rule out structures. And as an argument against physicalism, the above argument for structures can be reversed. 1. We observe structural properties of consciousness. 2. There are underlying phenomena producing them that we call our consciousness. 3. These are properties of consciousness that cannot be attributed to the physical world. 4. Therefore, on Leibniz's theory of indiscernibles, consciousness cannot be an aspect of the physical world. Yet in my view, the main argument in favour of a structural account is its power of explanation. In this regard, we can look at the four structures of intentionality, divisibility, insularity and insubstantiality. For example, intentionality is a relation between internal mental states and external cognitive objects. Intentionality thereby describes the relation between mind and object in externalism. In another context, intentionality explains the significance of objects as a supporting framework. And both intent and mental objects are important to the quality of mind produced. Intentionality implies a structural relation between its internal constitution and its external mental objects. We can explain this with Georges by taking Georges Bataille and how he compared mind to water in a bottle, that I extend the metaphor to that of liquid in a vessel. Here, the walls of the vessel are the cognitive frameworks which support and shape the mental liquid. And greater the quality, self-sufficiency and independence of that mental liquid, the less it will require to support an external cognitive frameworks. I have previously defined the above noted quality, sufficiency and independence of mind in terms of value, and that the origins of value can be explained in terms of contrast, selection, choice and preference, and that these features are aspects of divisibility as a general structure of consciousness. Divisibility opposes the traditional view of the unity of consciousness held by Descartes, Kant and even John Searle. I regard divisibility as a broad structure having application across the whole spectrum of mind. That is, from explaining perception to modalities of mind and to the separateness of individual people. Following Saussure, Wittgenstein and others, contrast as a form of divisibility is also essential to perception. All perceptions entail contrast as divisibility within themselves and with what they are not. Again, contrast is essential to perception, like the white spot on a black board. Divisibility even applies to people as individual consciousnesses, not accepted by some classical views. For Schopenhauer and Feuerbach, consciousness doesn't depend on individuals, they only participate in it. But Bernard Williams and others regard individual separateness as fundamental to modern thought. Yet crucially, divisibility also applies to the individual mind or consciousness in many ways. For example, in split brains and minds, in schizophrenia, in modes of consciousness and the unconscious, and the difference between affect and cognition, as well as in every instance of perception, of item, and in the production of value. Divisibility holds that I cannot be you and you cannot be me, because we are ontologically distinct entities. But insularity describes a further aspect of self-consciousness that is a form of epistemological solipsism. That is, self-consciousness cannot compare itself to other objects of the same type in the same way. I can compare or contrast myself to physical objects, but these are not objects of the same type as myself. I can compare or contrast myself to other conscious beings, but not in the same way as myself. This is because I apprehend myself directly in a way that I don't apprehend others. And because I cannot compare myself to other objects of the same type in the same way, I apprehend myself in a different way. That is, on the standard model, perception requires contrast and context, like again that white spot on a blackboard. But this kind of contrast, context or background is denied to self-consciousness, and this produces a different kind of apprehension that I call attenuated cognition. There are several interesting consequences of attenuated cognition that I want to outline. Firstly, attenuated cognition provides one reason why consciousness is difficult to understand. That is, understanding calls a contextual apprehension of the object in question, but a contextual apprehension of consciousness is problematic. This is because of the singularity that produces attenuated cognition. Secondly, attenuated cognition and insularity explains the characteristic mysteriousness of consciousness. This is because mysteriousness can be explained as a particular mode of apprehension. It is a mode of apprehending consciousness or anything else that lacks context. Other examples of mysterious objects can be given with limited contrasts or backgrounds of understanding, such as God, being, the universe, flying saucers, and the totality of things. Thirdly, on a standard account of meaning, self-consciousness should not exist without an ulterior reference. Consciousness should not be able to become self-conscious, but it does become self-consciousness. But because self-consciousness does exist, we need a further non-referential account of meaning, and that account is provided by attenuated reference as a product of insularity. The last explanative feature that I want to outline here is the structure of insubstantiality. Insubstantiality expresses the ephemeral, insular and divisible or fragmented character of consciousness. Consciousness is subject to diminution, cessation, finitude, dependency and contingency. It is subject to deformation, loss of capacities, value or self-esteem. Consciousness is nebulous, evanescent and tenuous. Heidegger and Sartre hold that the being of consciousness is in question. That I pose in terms of insubstantiality. Temporality produces impermanence, change, choice, responsibility and anxiety. Divisibility creates problems like personal fragmentation, internal conflicts and alienation. Graduation means that we not only develop but also diminish and eventually die. These structures pose the problem of consciousness in terms of its insubstantiality. Yet insubstantiality can also be illustrated by Sartre's contrast between two forms of being or existence. For Sartre, conscious or subjective being itself, being for itself, is a kind of nothingness, a lack or desire for being. Physical being in itself as a plenitude or permanence that has independent existence. Here, insubstantiality means that consciousness is precipitously seeking substantiality. In this respect, Sartre is correct that an insubstantial consciousness is seeking substantiality. But for Sartre, mankind is a useless passion in seeking the permanence of physicality. For Heidegger, the absolute impossibility of existence must be taken up as an authentic possibility of life. But instead of Sartre's useless passion in seeking the permanence of physicality, I offer a more attainable alternative in pursuing a sufficiency of value. In conclusion, the question, what is consciousness, can't be answered in a single sentence. It's more difficult to simplify than even the difficult question, what is matter? But a number of both features as well as misleading ideas have been outlined. Firstly, consciousness isn't a kind of substance. Descartes took this notion from Renaissance science. Similarly, in my view, physicalism falsely sees consciousness as just the refinement of the physical world. And insisting that consciousness is an aspect of the physical world ensures that it won't be understood. The physical world is understood through empirical a posteriori observation. Mathematics is understood through necessary a priori relations. Consciousness must also be understood according to its own characteristics. Consciousness had a different mode of existence and must be understood in a different kind of way. That is, through a first-person perspective and phenomenological observation as well as reason. I myself argued for an interactive and structural view of consciousness as a relation and process. Structures were intentionality, temporality, graduation, divisibility, insularity, ephemerality, and insubstantiality. The feature of relation was explained with the notions of intentionality and externalism. The feature of time was explained with the feature of process was explained with the notion of time or temporality. A final caution can be made about the confusion over the character and definition of consciousness. And in my view, physicalism, panpsychism and cosmic consciousness are symptoms of this confusion. Next week we'll be discussing the origins of mind and consciousness in matter. So let me have your criticisms or comments on websites like meetup.com, philosophy of value workshops.